Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Whether it's backup power for a hospital or a microgrid for a public facility, FEMA's hazard mitigation programs are designed to reduce future disaster losses before they occur. A recent GAO review examined how communities make the case for those investments and how FEMA evaluates whether they're worth the cost. For more, Federal Drive host Terry Gerton spoke to Janet McKelvey, Acting Director for Natural Resources and Environment at GAO.
When people hear about renewable energy, they often think about climate or energy policy, but your report approaches it from a really different direction. How do renewable energy projects support FEMA's hazard mitigation programs?
Yeah, sure. That's a very interesting question. Hazard mitigation is really about proactively taking steps to reduce or eliminate risks to people, property, communities when you have some sort of natural hazard, be it a hurricane or a heat wave or flood or that type of thing. What FEMA does in this instance is that they have applicants apply for funding. And what we found in our report is that these are really small scale renewable energy projects. And they're really for things like secondary backup power for critical facilities to maintain essential infrastructure. So just think about if, say, the electric grid goes out in a hurricane or a flood or extreme weather event, then you're going to want the hospital that's nearby to have some sort of power source. And so you could use rooftop solar power panels or solar generators could be one source of power for that hospital to make sure that they have the power they need and that the people in the hospital don't have problems with the lack of ventilators or that type of thing.
So it really is about resilience, especially related to energy and power. What did you find when you looked at the FEMA funding over the last several years?
Yeah, we looked at the funding for a 3-year period from fiscal years 2022 through 2024, and we found that FEMA funded small-scale renewable energy projects, about $13.6 million for 14 different projects during that time frame.
So that's not a lot of money and also not a lot of projects. Is there any kind of limit on this? Is the limit on the number of projects a funding cap, or is it just something else that's going on here?
We didn't look into whether there's a limit, but it is a small amount. There's several different hazard mitigation projects or hazard mitigation programs that FEMA has. We had 3 different programs that we looked at: their hazard mitigation grant program, a pre-disaster mitigation congressionally directed spending program, and then building resilient infrastructure and communities program. And these 3 programs, that's the type of that was just the number. We didn't look at whether there was any sort of cap to our,
And these are, as you said, small projects, typically community-based or even locality, single structure-based, as you said, like a hospital. Are larger utility grid projects part of this program, or is that a different issue with FEMA?
Yeah, they're not a part of this program. We did look across some FEMA funding to see if there were any utility scale renewable funding projects at FEMA. And what we found is that there were not. And what we're thinking of there in terms of utility scale is generating power for the utilities. And, utilities have a number of different sources. It could be renewables like solar and wind, but also oil, gas that help generate power for the grid. And that's not the type of funding that FEMA is using. And we did ask FEMA about that, and they told us that that really is something they would depend on, say, the Department of Energy to do. They're really focused on this hazard mitigation side of things. And, where can they have strategies for preparedness in the event of a disaster? And that's really where they spend their funding.
Janet McKelvey is Acting Director of the Natural Resources and Environment team at GAO. Janet, let's go back to the kinds of projects that these kinds of grants are funding. They're typically critical facilities operating during disasters. Why are the microgrids and backup power systems getting attention in this context?
Yeah, microgrids, and they're really back to the sort of secondary backup power for critical facilities. They're a way to make sure that there's power for hospitals or a recreation center. Think about a recreation center. If power goes out in a community and it's a heat wave, an extreme heat wave, they might not have any power, but maybe if you have power in the recreation center, then people have a place to go so that they can stay safe and stay cool in that heat wave. And so that's really how this comes up in the context of hazard mitigation, is if we have prepared for that in advance and we've provided funding for these microgrids or these solar generators for key facilities, critical facilities, then that's going to help when the next disaster or extreme weather hazard hits a community.
And one of the points that you bring up in your report is that all of these projects have to demonstrate cost effectiveness in order to qualify for the grants. How does FEMA determine whether a project qualifies?
Yeah, FEMA has a benefit cost analysis that they do, and they really are comparing the project's avoided future damage to the costs of the project over a lifetime. So we describe that process in our report, and that's how they make sure it's cost effective. Do the benefits outweigh the costs?
But you also point out that doing that math can be challenging for some communities.
Yes, that's right. And we also have some prior work that has identified some of the challenges that applicants have in completing that data. It requires a lot of resources and a lot of data. It can be hard to measure things like the impact of extreme heat, for instance. What is the cost of that?
Do you have any recommendations for how communities can simplify that calculation?
We don't have recommendations in this particular report, but we talk about some prior recommendations that we've had in our prior work, and also steps that FEMA took since that prior work to simplify things for applicants. For instance, they've reduced some of the data entry requirements. They've pre-calculated some benefit cost analyses for key items like a hospital generator, so that if you've already got that cost in there, it's going to simplify coming up with that total benefit cost analysis. So they've taken steps.
Again, sort of going back to the scale of this program, you mentioned 14 projects, 13.6 million. When you think about that in the context of the entire country and all of the natural disasters that could be experienced, there doesn't seem to be a lot of uptake for this program. If the application process were easier, do you think more communities might take advantage of this program?
I definitely think that's a possibility. I will point out that our focus here was on the renewable energy projects. And so there may be other projects that aren't specifically renewable energy projects in these hazard mitigation programs, but we really wanted to see what was going on in the renewable space. So I'm sure there are other projects going on that were not within our scope. But that said, sure, I mean, simplifying the application process, making it easier for applicants, that is absolutely something that would increase the ability of others to apply.
As you look forward, what lessons do you take from this report to look at the future of resilience investments? Do you think renewable energy-based projects are likely to remain sort of a niche use of this FEMA funding, or do you see growing interest?
Yeah, I think we'll have to wait and see on that. Certainly there is some interest, I think, in hazard mitigation and how in preparedness for disasters. The more prepared you are, the easier it makes it when the disaster hits to focus on the key areas. So we'll just have to see on that. But there's plenty of work, I think, on FEMA, and we're always looking at new things about how FEMA's doing in terms of disasters response.
Janet McKelvey is Acting Director of Natural Resources and Environment at the Government Accountability Office.